The prosecution's case against Audrey Edmunds rested on a single claim. It's October 16, 1995, Wanakee, Wisconsin. A 7-month-old named Natalie Beard arrives at a daycare centre. Fussy, normal, but by evening she's dead. And the state's expert will testify that because she appeared fine that morning, the fatal injury must have occurred while Edmunds was caring for her. That certainty was wrong, and because it was wrong, Audrey Edmunds, the woman running the daycare centre that day, spent 11 years in prison for a crime that never happened. Edmunds settled Natalie into a car seat. She propped a bottle up beside her and turned away. When she came back, Natalie was still. Formula at her nose, and paramedics could not save her. This is where the case fractures into two timelines, and only one can be true. The prosecution's expert testified with absolute certainty that the injury produces no lucid intervals. The child collapsed the moment the damage is done. Therefore, the fatal shaking happened on Edmunds' watch. Full stop. But the defence called a paediatric neurologist, Dr. Mary Dominski, who argued that Natalie was shaken, but placed the shaking at an earlier time, well before Natalie ever arrived at Edmunds' door. Two doctors, same injury, two timelines that could not be true. The jury chose the state's science. Audrey Edmunds was convicted of first-degree reckless homicide. But this case would not stay closed, because the science underpinning the verdict, the very science the jury was told was settled, was starting to unravel. And over the next decade, it would collapse entirely. This is the story of shaken baby syndrome, what it was, what it became, and what the courts, even now, still refuse to see. Audrey Edmunds was not the first, and she was not the last. And the weapon that convicted her had been quietly forged decades before she ever set foot into the daycare centre. Chapter 2. The Emergence of Shaken Baby Syndrome. For 60 years, American courtrooms convicted parents and caregivers of murder based on 3 internal injuries and 1 radiologist's hypothesis. That hypothesis was never proven scientifically, and because it was never proven, people lost decades of their lives for a crime that never actually existed. This is how it was built. In the 1940s, a radiologist by the name of John Caffey noticed something that didn't make sense. Infants were arriving at hospital with bleeding inside their skull and unexplained fractures in their limbs. There was internal damage, but no external injuries to match. Caffey was a paediatric radiologist, publishing a hypothesis in a medical journal, not a medical expert in court. His observations drifted through the medical margins for decades. It seemed harmless enough at the time, but then in the 1970s, a British neurosurgeon by the name of Norman Guthkelch picked up the thread. But he wasn't looking for a crime. He was looking for an explanation. He had seen infants with subdural bleeding with no impact injuries before, and he proposed something that would reshape medicine and law for half a century. Maybe the shaking was enough. No impact, no blunt force trauma, just panic, violence, and a pair of adult hands. It was an elegant theory. Caffey took Guthkelch's mechanism and attached it into something sharper, a diagnostic triad. 3 internal signs, 3 shadows on a scan: subdural hemorrhage, retinal hemorrhage, and a swollen brain. Caffey argued that you are looking at an unmistakable fingerprint of abuse. Not a possibility, not a differential diagnosis, a fingerprint of abuse. A hypothesis is supposed to be tested. This one wasn't. It bypassed the science entirely and reconstructed itself into a courtroom fact. And that word, unmistakable, would echo through the courtrooms for the next 40 years. What Caffey and Guthkelch were trying to do was protect children, but what they had done was they had built a tool that became a legal device that destroyed families. By 2002, the Triad surfaced as legal certainty, and that very year, Drayton Witt of Phoenix, Arizona, was convicted of the murder of his 5-month-old stepson, Stephen. The prosecution told the jury that Stephen's medical history didn't matter, and that because he collapsed in Witt's care, Witt must have caused it. But their most damning claim was the triad itself, the subdural bleeding, the retinal hemorrhages, and the brain swelling. They claimed it was diagnostic of shaking and that nothing else fitted the pattern. No bruises, no grip marks, nothing on the skin that spoke of violence. The defence walked into the courtroom where Shaken Baby was treated as an unquestionable medical fact. They didn't challenge it, they didn't cross-examine its foundations. They accepted the prosecution's framing that the triad equals abuse and that the collapse must have been immediate. There were no other medical conditions that could mimic this finding, and that the doctor's evidence was scientific certainty. At 18 years old, Drayton Witt was sentenced to 12 years in prison. And that's where the story takes an unexpected turn, because Norman Guthkelch, the neurosurgeon whose mechanism had built the very diagnosis that convicted Witt, reviewed Witt's case, and things didn't add up. We'll get to that soon. Chapter 3, How Shaken Baby Syndrome Became a Conviction Machine. The trial of Drayton Witt was not a one-off. It was the logical end point of a system that had spent 3 decades treating a hypothesis as fact. And here's how the machine worked in the Witt case. A child arrived at hospital, unresponsive and sometimes seizing. The triad was found on a scan: the subdural bleeding, retinal hemorrhages and a swollen brain. And at that moment the medical inquiry ended and the criminal one began. The same group of physicians appeared in case after case, state after state, testifying that the triad was diagnostic of shaking. There were no natural diseases that could produce the same constellation of injury. If the caregiver's story didn't match the timeline, then the caregiver was lying. Jurors were instructed explicitly that the triad was consistent with abuse, not that it was one possibility among several. Defence attorneys faced an impossible task. How do you cross-examine a medical certainty? How do you tell a jury that the science they have just heard, described as settled, is in fact not settled at all? The expert witness pipeline ran in one direction. The prosecution's physicians testified in dozens, if not hundreds of cases. Their certainty had been rehearsed and refined across decades of courtroom appearances. The defence had no equivalent, no counter-experts, no alternative framework, no language to challenge the diagnosis without sounding like they were defending child abuse. Prosecutors wielded the triad like a smoking gun. Caregivers, parents, babysitters, daycare providers found themselves facing murder charges, manslaughter and even child abuse charges on the strength of internal injuries alone. In these cases there were no bruises, there were no grip marks, nothing on the skin, just 3 shadows on a scan and a room full of people who believed it. By the turn of the century, the triad had paired hundreds of convictions. In case after case, the injury spoke and the accused were left with nothing but denials. Shaken Baby Syndrome wasn't just a diagnosis, it was a presumption of guilt dressed in a white coat. And then the man who invented it took another look. Norman Guthkelch, the British neurosurgeon who in 1971 developed this very diagnosis, which is now fueling the legal medical machine, was deeply troubled by what the courts had done with his work. He reviewed the Witt case, and he was horrified. Stephen's history of seizures was so extensive and so clearly relevant to what had happened to him that Guthkelch could not understand how shaken baby syndrome had been diagnosed at all. The medical history that the prosecution had dismissed as irrelevant contained the alternate explanation the courtroom had refused to consider. He concluded there was no evidence of abuse, and then in 2012, Drayton Witt's conviction was vacated. He spent a decade behind bars for a crime that, according to the very doctor who created the diagnosis, never existed in the first place. One of the architects of the Triad had just told the legal system it was wrong. But the question now is the system listening? Chapter 4, the Louise Woodward case, the trial that divided the world. By the 1990s, shaken baby syndrome had settled into the legal system like a foregone conclusion. Something assumed and not questioned. The Triad didn't suggest abuse, it declared it. And its mere appearance was treated as a signature of violence. The accusation was immediate, so was the accused's denial. The medical evidence didn't resolve this contradiction, it deepened it. But their denials were neatly folded into the case against them. The diagnosis itself didn't just suggest guilt, it defined it. And then, in 1997, the Louise Woodward case emerged. An 18-year-old British au pair in a routine afternoon in Massachusetts, and an infant who suddenly collapsed in her care. A courtroom divided by competing medical theories, two sides of the same triad, pointing in the opposite direction. The prosecution argued the triad of subdural bleeding, retinal hemorrhage and brain swelling. They insisted that these injuries could only have ever been caused by violent shaking and a forceful impact moments before Matthew became unresponsive. They argued Woodward acted out of frustration, slamming and shaking the child in a moment of anger. The defence started with the injury timeline. Matthew's wounds were old, already formed, long before Woodward ever picked him up. They moved to his history of falls, the earlier head trauma, the signs of decline that predated the collapse. They then stripped away the prosecution's theory, piece by piece. With the physical evidence gone, they turned to the doctrine itself, arguing that the triad was not a fingerprint of shaking, and that the prosecution's experts were claiming certainty where none existed. This wasn't a crime, it was a tragedy. Matthew's collapse was medical, and Woodward became the accused because she was the one holding him when the inevitable happened. The jury heard both sides. The question now was whether the courtroom still believed the triad was unshakable or whether Louise Woodward had just cracked it open. The jury came back with a second-degree murder verdict. The silence in the courtroom was heavy. But then the judge stepped in, a single judge with a single ruling. He cut the conviction down to manslaughter, and he rewrote the fate the jury had just carved in stone. One judge, one ruling, and suddenly the diagnosis that had convicted hundreds was no longer beyond question. But the system didn't stop using it. For the first time, the public saw what the courtroom had been hiding. Shaken baby syndrome was not a airtight doctrine as it once had been sold. The early 2000s brought questions the courtroom wasn't ready to hear. Biomechanical engineers asked something devastatingly simple. Can shaking alone really generate the forces needed to produce the triad without breaking the neck? Other researchers published evidence of medical mimics, alternative conditions capable of producing the same finding without violence, birth trauma, infection, metabolic disorders that break down the body's biochemical machinery, conditions that could produce the same triad of subdural bleeding, retinal hemorrhages and brain swelling without any evidence of violence. The once unquestioned diagnosis was fracturing. Between 2000 and 2007, convictions weakened. Some were quietly overturned. Alternative explanations emerged. But no landmark case and no dramatic moment. Just the slow, grinding work of the appeals court confronting evidence that no longer held. Judges start to hear words once unthinkable in these cases. Reasonable doubt. But still no precedent, no floodgates, just cracks. And then there was the case of Audrey Edmunds, who was convicted in 1996. Sitting in prison as the science evolved around her, her case was almost entirely built on shaking baby syndrome testimony. The triad was the smoking gun. Then in 2008, the Wisconsin's Court of Appeal saw what every court before it had looked past. They threw out her conviction, recognising that today's jurors might see the triad not as a smoking gun, but as an unresolved medical puzzle. Prosecutors walked away from the case. The era of unquestioned shaken baby syndrome was over. Chapter 5. When Science Challenged Shaken Baby Syndrome. So when it comes to shaken baby syndrome, the closer the lens focused, the blurrier the certainty became. Biomechanical research had arrived at a paradox the theory simply could not survive. To generate the forces necessary to produce the triad, an infant would have to be shaken so violently that the neck would break. Cervical spine fractures, torn ligaments, structural damage to the spinal cord. Yet, in case after case, including Edmunds, the neck was untouched. No fractures, no torn ligaments, nothing to match the violence the theory required. It was a quiet but devastating contradiction. The injuries didn't fit the mechanism of harm. And then behind the scenes, defence attorneys began filing appeals built on this mismatch. Judges, once confident in the neat simplicity of the triad, found themselves staring at evidence that refused to behave in the way they thought it should have. The certainty that had carried shaken baby syndrome through the 1980s and 90s was falling apart. Edmunds became the precedent and courts started admitting dissenting science. Defence teams brought biomechanical specialists, neuroradiologists and geneticists, experts who could stand in front of a jury and say, this triad is not evidence of abuse, but it is evidence of a diagnostic failure. The legal system finally began to see shaken baby syndrome for what it always was, an untested hypothesis that had risen on sheer confidence, failing in every direction at once. But here's what makes the story darker than a simple tale of scientific progress. Shaken baby syndrome had functioned as a diagnosis of exclusion. If no accident was witnessed and no disease was obvious, abuse filled the void. And it was shaken baby syndrome that did that. It was a logic built on absence, a theory that stepped in whenever the facts refused to cooperate. And as these cases unravelled across the United Kingdom, the United States, Canada and Australia, a troubling pattern emerged. The diagnosis had been used not to find the truth, but to close cases. Shaken baby syndrome was never a formal statement of law, but it became the shortcut for the stand-in for actus rea, that is, the act of wrongdoing, and mens rea, the intent of that wrongful act. It was a medical conclusion that silenced the case before the evidence could ever utter a word. By the late 2000s, the field had split. In courtroom after courtroom, medical experts clashed in full view of the public. Some held fast to the old doctrine the Triad still pointed to violent shaking, while others argued the opposite. The Triad was non-specific, a pattern demanding a full differential diagnosis, not a single predetermined conclusion. The field was no longer unified. Some experts still defended the diagnosis. Others called for its abandonment. And in that gap between them, parents, caregivers waited in prison, some on death row, for the science to decide whether the crime they had been convicted of had actually ever occurred. Chapter 6, The Rebranding That Didn't Fix Shaken Baby Syndrome. By the late 2000s, medicine found itself at a crossroads. The old certainty of shaken baby syndrome was slipping. So it was replaced by a quieter, more cautious understanding of infant head trauma. Major medical bodies, including the American Academy of Pediatrics, began to acknowledge what defence experts had been saying for years. The term shaken baby syndrome was too narrow, too accusatory, too legally loaded, and then in 2009, the Academy formally recommended the broad term abusive head trauma. The new name was meant to acknowledge that those injuries could result from shaking, impact, or both. It was meant to be more precise, more cautious, less prosecutorial. But here's the problem. Changing the name doesn't change the mechanism. It doesn't resolve the biomechanical paradox. It doesn't address the fact that the underlying triad and those three shadows on a scan remain the same diagnostic foundation, just under new branding. And in many courtrooms, even now, abusive head trauma functions exactly as shaken baby syndrome did. Same triad, same presumption, same logic of exclusion. The name changed, the machinery didn't. Today, abusive head trauma sits in a strange place in the law. Some jurisdictions demand a full differential diagnosis so as to rule out mimics, and a mechanism of injury must be proven and a timeline established. Others still accept the triad as sufficient. A parent's fate can turn on nothing more than the jurisdiction where their child collapsed. Identical injuries, opposite outcomes. For the Audrey Edmundsons of the world, the ones convicted under the old doctrine and only later exonerated, the science moved faster than the appeal process itself. Some have finally walked free, others remain in prison, their cases untouched by the very debates that have reshaped the field. So the courts keep convicting under a new name, the same old certainty, which brings us to this point. Chapter 7, Shaken Baby Syndrome and the Future of Justice. Because shaken baby syndrome isn't a story about whether child abuse exists. It does. It's not a story about whether shaking can injure an infant, because it can. This is a story about what happens when a medical theory outruns the evidence and the legal system builds convictions on top of it because the science catches up. The triad wasn't invented to convict the innocent. It was created to identify the guilty. But when a diagnostic tool lacks specificity, it becomes a weapon, and not because anyone meant it to become one, but because a system desperate for legal certainty will always take the comfort of probability and call it proof. The remedy isn't to discard the triad, it's to use it properly. A full differential diagnosis, independent expert review before charges are laid. Routine second opinions in cases built on internal injuries alone. And a legal system willing to say the evidence is contested, and contested evidence demands more, not less, scrutiny before it takes someone's freedom. That's not radical, It's basic due process, but due process has a problem with this diagnosis, and the problem has a face. In the next episode of the Triad, we turn to the case of Philip Peace in the United Kingdom, a man whose conviction now sits before the Criminal Cases Review Commission, and who has already spent 5 years in prison under the same Triad logic that once sent Audrey Edmunds away. His future is locked into a minimum term life sentence, and the science that put him there is the same science and the same doubt we have been talking about. If the law cannot tell the difference between certainty and consensus, between proof and pattern, then it isn't justice it's delivering, it's closure. And those are not the same thing. If this channel does one thing, it documents what happens when the legal system mistakes consensus for certainty. And if that matters to you, subscribe. The next case is already waiting. I'll see you in the next video.